Hey, this is Dana. Today I'm going to try an experiment with this portrait study I made in a workshop with Alicia Poncio. If you're interested in figurative sculpture, I totally recommend her classes. She's amazing. I didn't have any shims, so I thought I'd try this method I've read about, which uses dental floss to create the parting seam in the initial coat of plaster. I'm pressing the dental floss into the surface of the clay. My first layer of plaster needs a little pigment in it so I can see the print coat when I'm chipping it off at the end. A waste mold is a one-time use plaster mold. So I apply the initial coat of plaster directly to the surface of the clay model with a brush. And when that plaster is gelled, then I pull the string that creates the seam. Then I make a clay wall for the rest of my parting seam. I put this clay wall right next to the cut from the string. And then I use a watery clay slip to make a barrier between plaster coats so that they separate. The chunky bits on the surface help lock the two layers of plaster together. My second coat doesn't need to be super thick, but it gets a layer of hemp fiber to reinforce it. My mold needs to be strong enough to withstand the demold, which is the tricky part. The clay wall should come off really cleanly from the plaster if you pull carefully. The backside goes on just like the front, separated with clay slip, hemp fiber reinforcement, and a not super thick layer of plaster. Then, using wood wedges, I gently tap to create pressure, and I use water from a spray bottle on the seam. Never pry. This just simply takes time. This whole part, to get the back off, took about an hour. And once it's loose, it comes off really, really easily. Then I just dig the clay out of the rest of it and make sure the mold is clean. I put several layers of plaster separator into my mold. I use Murphy's oil soap and water. You can buy a commercial separator, but you have to let the layers dry between coats. The plaster should be wet when you do this. So I'm using Puritan pottery plaster for the whole process. I brush in my layers for my casting and I look for air bubbles. I'm looking to get a nice even coat into both sides of my mold. And then I'll reinforce it with a little bit of hemp fiber. And I want it to be thick enough, but I'm not looking to make a solid casting. It's stronger if it's hollow and thin and has an even thickness. Once I've got it reinforced, then I put the two parts of it together. I close the mold up with some rubber bands, and then I'm going to use my hand for whatever part I can reach to help close that seam up. Additional layers are poured in through the hole and rolled around inside of there and poured out, and then I mix some more, pour it in, roll it around, pour it out, and I do that several times to get a strong hollow cast. This can be heavy, can be a little tricky. I pour a lot of plaster on the floor. It's just a messy business. There's no getting around it. So chipping off the waste mold is fun. It's probably the closest I'll ever get to stone carving, but my chisel is a big screwdriver. I want to try and separate the second layer first, if that makes sense. The reinforcing layer, I want to get that off. I'm trying not to hit the surface of my casting with my big screwdriver. So having that separation in there that allows that reinforcing coat to come off first means then that I can see that lightly tinted blue layer and I can easily flake that off of the surface without damaging my casting. Malvina Hoffman talked about this process in her great book, Sculpture Inside and Out. She was a phenomenal portrait artist from the early 20th century who worked with Rodin and knew Brancusi. She tells an incredible story about Helen Keller visiting her studio and feeling the emotions of her sculptures with her hands. I personally have gotten so much out of reading the great books on sculpture by important historical figures. And I like to try some of the things that I can that I read about in their books. And so this was a fun one to create a waste mold without using shims, just using some dental floss to cut the initial print coat and then doing the rest of the waste molding process just like you normally would. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this little video on the waste mold, and check out some of my others. Thanks.